preservation of and increased access to the 92nd Street Y Humanities Audio Archives is generously funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
Good evening.
Oh, forget. Tell me later.
It's my pleasure to welcome you to the 92nd Street Y this evening for the Jewish Literary Exchange. Back with us to facilitate our series is Dr. Margot Krebs, and of course our special guest for this evening, Joe Berger, writer for the New York Times and author of Displaced Persons. I just want to point out that we're selling copies of the book in the back, so if your copy is worn out or if you're looking for a good Hanukkah gift, you can see Arturo in the back. Thank you for coming and enjoy the evening.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. It's very nice to have you all here, and of course, very, very nice to have you here.
Thank you, Margot.
I'd like to just, I don't know whether you've been joining us in the past, and we usually choose to read passages from the books that we discuss. In this particular case, I actually would like to read a little more than I usually do. And one of the reasons that I want to do that is that I find the book so extraordinarily vivid. And the people that I've spoken to have told me that in one way or another, they identify, they see something in the book that rings a bell, whether it's because of experiences that they have had or people that they've known. And so I would like to kind of do the book justice by reading it just a little bit. But also, we'd like to invite your comments. So please feel free to jump in. Okay? First of all, Joe, if I may call you Joe, what made you write this book? And particularly, what made you write it from such a very personal point of view?
Well, a writer, I think, writes a book that's this personal because he or she feels they have to write the book. I mean, I began toying with stories from my life. I think I first decided to write them as fiction and short stories. And eventually I realized, that there was a certain shape to my life that in a way represented an entire culture, a very distinct, maybe we won't call it a culture, we'll call it a subculture. A distinct group of people, the Grine, as they call themselves. These are the Jewish survivors of the Holocaust who came over here between 1946 and 1953 or 4. There were about 140,000 of them, and they had this very distinct subculture. Everything from the way they socialized with each other, the way they dealt with their children. And I wanted that memorialized. I felt that culture needed to be remembered because it was distinct and it had a very particular shape. And I thought that by telling the story of my family, I'd be able to do that. And a lot has been written about the Holocaust. Volumes have been written about the life of the Jews before the war, but very little has been written about this group of people who came over here after the war and the lives they led here. Not from a clinical point of view, there have been books, but just what their ordinary day-to-day life was like, how they picked schools for their kids, how they dealt with kids who knew English right away and they didn't. How they dealt with talking about their experiences during the war, about their lost families, about the grandparents their kids never had. All that I felt needed to be told, and in the ordinary day-to-day fashion, and I try to do that in my book.
Well, I'd like to begin your story the way you do, perched high in the stately offices of the New York Times, with this reflection. Like many immigrants and children of immigrants, I have always lived in two worlds at the same time. There is my American world, jobs at prestigious companies, a co-op on the West Side or a house in the suburbs, evenings at the theater and summers in the Berkshires. And there's the immigrant world that tinges all that comfort with a sense of raw peril, terror of imminent poverty, and sometimes an awareness of one's foreignness. To be sure, it also lives on in an ability to laugh at the pretensions of life, and even occasionally in a kind of immigrant pride at how much we have accomplished. But its virtues are soon outweighed by the hovering fear that all will be snatched away by some malicious whim of the universe. For isn't that what happened to my parents and their generations of European Jews? So, I know this is a hard question, but do you continue to live at some level with this anxiety?
I think I do. I think I don't know about imminent poverty.
Good for you.
You know, but I think there's a certain sense of uneasiness, of not quite believing that I'm very rooted in this culture, in this world. Even it comes up in very ordinary kind, and also a sense of true peril. I mean, a certain suspiciousness of what is about to happen. I'll give you a good example. We had an anthrax scare at the New York Times. Someone sent Judy Miller, who is our germ warfare expert, an envelope filled with a white powder. It fell over her blouse and skirt. She then walked around the newsroom using a telephone and walked right by me. And the Times decided that everyone who was within a certain radius, 10 feet, let's say, or 10 yards, I forget what it was, needed to be tested. So they called in the Department of Health and they gave nose swabs to everybody. I insisted that I get tested because I figured they don't know what the hell they're doing about anthrax. And it was interesting because other Times reporters kind of shrugged this off as a hoax.
Really?
And it turned out they were right. It was a hoax. But I knew somewhere that maybe it wasn't a hoax. And I think that's the kind of mentality that you kind of grow up with. A certain I mean, when you grow up with a mother who, when you stayed out too late, would stay up all night with her head poked out the window waiting for you to show up because she was afraid, something might happen. You kind of pick up that kind of sense of...
Everybody doesn't grow up with such a mother.
Well, one of the problems with the book is to distinguish Jewish from refugee, I mean, many of the experiences are standard Jewish mother kind of things, but many are very, very, very specific to being a refugee.
Right. So you depict, as a byproduct of Jewish history, the relationship among Jews. Some survivors had relatives here who could help them get started. But just as often, those ties were soon bruised by obligation and dependence. Nobody really was to blame. The American Jews were only one step up the American ladder. They may have scorned the reminders of their own squalid immigrant roots, resented having to share scarce resources, and perhaps felt a little discomfort at not having done more to save their imperiled kin. And of course, just as the wave of refugees boasted a sprinkling of artists and doctors, it also had its share of freeloaders and connivers who made compassion difficult. So I think you're primarily referring here to the post-Holocaust years, but I guess by implication to the role of American Jewry pre-Holocaust in the 1930s?
Well, no, I am referring to the post-Holocaust years, and I think what I was trying to capture there, and I do in other places in the book as well, I think there was a distinct distance between the refugee community and the American Jewish community. Maybe even a chill. For example, my parents, it wasn't just that some of their friends were refugees, all their friends were refugees. They didn't really have any American friends, American Jewish friends even, until they were kind of middle class, until maybe 7, 8, 9 years into this country. And even then, the people they always felt most comfortable with were the refugees. And I think a lot of this had to do with the fact that they felt no one could understand what had happened to them except other survivors. I think that they felt it was easiest to talk about their experience to other survivors, that they didn't have to explain as much, that the history and the emotion and the sociology of what they were talking about was just understood in the bones by other survivors, whereas it was frustrating and often difficult to talk to American Jews about these things. And I think there was also a sense that maybe American Jews didn't want to listen, that it was maybe too painful or uncomfortable to listen to some of the experiences. I think there was also, as I tried to indicate, a certain guilt on the part of Americans that they hadn't done enough, maybe a feeling on the part of the refugees, the survivors, that the Americans hadn't done more. And then, of course, language was a barrier. The American Jews, many of the American Jews didn't speak Yiddish, and that was the language of the survivors when they came here, and their English was very uncomfortable. And also, I think the American Jews, in many cases, were just, as I said, one step up the ladder. They'd just entered the middle class. They were, living on the concourse or living in Eastern Parkway in Brooklyn, and they wanted, they didn't want to be reminded of that Lower East Side past. The tenement apartments, the habits of poverty, and I think there was this distance that resulted.
And yet for your own family, you seem to have encountered kind of the opposite when you made that move from the Upper West Side to the Grand Concourse. You said the probability was that our neighbors were reconciled to their modest lives at 12:30 and resented us for scraping for something better, even something more authentically Jewish. The crisp press of the clothes we wore, the book bags bulging with yeshiva school books, the piano teachers traveling up from Manhattan, the sleepaway summer camps, all that effort galled them. Experience had taught them how futile it all was. Here we were worried about concealing our blemishes while they were snickering at our virtues.
I think what I was getting at there was the sense that, the refugees were immigrants, and as immigrants, they felt this enormous uncertainty as to what would happen to them. They still hadn't fully established themselves, still hadn't, collected nest eggs to keep them, make them feel a little bit safe. And as I wrote a book before this one about the kids who win the Westinghouse Awards and what that says about science education. And one of the very surprising statistics I came up with was that 1/3 of the winners in many years were immigrants. Imagine the entire country, 1/3 are immigrants. Well, immigrants bring a kind of striving because, it comes out of a sense of we need to make it fast, and their kids pick up these habits. And so they work hard to make sure their kids get into Bronx Science and Stuyvesant, and there's a certain striving that takes place that I think in the culture I was describing on the concourse, there may have been a little more complacency, and that produced a certain dissonance.
Well, what you say about immigrants striving certainly was true of this generation that you're depicting, the generation of which you are a part. Do you think that it is still true of the present generation of immigrants?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. You know, the kids who do the Westinghouses now are still largely immigrants. You know, there was a time when American Jews won a very disproportionate share of these awards, and the winners today are, you know, Chinese, Indian. The Jews who win it are Russian. There's a certain, you know, to want to go home at the end of the day and not watch television but work on a science project for 3, 4, 5 hours takes a certain kind of discipline and even a sense of wanting to compensate for what your parents can't do for you. And a lot of these kids know that their parents are looking to them to redeem their lives. You know, but the simple act of transferring countries is a huge handicap for an adult. In many cases, the adults who do it realize that they'll probably earn more as a taxi driver here than they could have earned, you know, as a physicist in India. However, they're not going to become a physicist in this. They may not become a physicist in this country. They may have to stay at that level because of the problems with English, and et cetera. So they, you know, anyway, I think that was the point I was trying to make.
So do you think that the children tend to want to compensate their parents in some way?
I think they do.
That part,
I think
that's part of the drive?
They realize that their parents are looking to them to become what the parents can no longer become, and that message is very, very clear. You know, not only that message, but the message of, you know, the kind of reliance on the children for being the interpreter of the English world. And I've spoken to a number of immigrant groups about this book, not non-Jewish immigrant groups, and they tell me similar stories where, you know, they were expected to interpret government inquiries and Con Ed bills and any kind of difficult matters that required a knowledge of English. You know, and sometimes the parents, because they feel so inadequate as a result of their lack of English and their lack of knowledge of this country, will put burdens on a child that just way beyond what they could handle. I mean, I remember my parents would ask when there was a time they thought maybe they would buy a small business like a laundromat, and they would, you know, I was like 12, and they would take me around and ask me what I thought about it as a business. You know, I mean, what did I know from laundromats? You know,
did you
but
advise for or
they thought
against?
because I was being educated in America, I must know something. You know.
Well, in fact, I want to quote, you're quoting here a remark by a Vietnamese boat person who says, surprising as it may seem, the daily struggle of making a living in America is more difficult to cope with than all of the events we went through in prison and at sea. The reason is that there's nothing heroic about surviving the never-ending problems of daily life. But you know, when you read this book, I mean, I don't know about people in the audience, but I had the sense that your parents really were heroes in many ways. And on the other hand, I think that what I admired tremendously about it was the candor with which you depict them, even sometimes the ambivalence that you felt. So I think this may be a kind of a hard acknowledgement that you make.
Well,
go ahead.
I think you're not wrong when you use the word heroes. I mean, obviously it's a word that's been greatly cheapened, but you know, the surviving the Holocaust itself, how getting through the war, getting through either the camps or the rigors of hiding or flight, was often a matter of chance or whim. You know, it didn't depend on any great virtues on your part. You showed up at Auschwitz, someone told you to go to the right, or if someone told you to go to the left. If you went to the right, you lived. If you went to the right, you died. You had no control over what you did. But I would argue that the survivors who came here had to make very deliberate decisions and take very deliberate actions to resettle themselves, to reimplant their life, to rebuild their lives. And I think that required a certain amount of resourcefulness, courage, a sense of optimism about the future. And I think, you know, to have been able to feel that optimism after what they had been through is, to me, heroic.
Absolutely.
I mean, to make decisions to have children, for example, after they saw their little brothers and sisters killed, after making decisions to get married. You know, these things seem so obvious, but that they found those resources within themselves is you know, took a certain strength of character.
I understand that in the DP camps in Germany, there were in fact a rash of marriages and births, because this also meant an affirmation of life.
That's right. In fact, I read recently that because, you know, so many of the survivors were in the same age group. You know, the very young were killed, the very old were killed. But as a result of that, by the late 1940s, the DP camps had one of the highest birth rates in the world, because people realized that, you know, they clung to each other, often inappropriately, meaning that, you know, there were lots of marriages that were as convenient as they were romantic, because people just needed to resume their lives and have some stability in their lives. But yet they did have lots of children. You know, I have this wonderful picture. I think it's in my book, actually, of myself in the Schlachtensee DP camp, sitting on a platform of some sort with like 8 or 9 other children. They were all in my age group, because we were all, you know, all these people were starting new families to replace the families they had lost.
And to achieve, I guess, some sense of normalcy, if that could be achieved. So that brings me to another topic. I get the sense, you use your mother's journal, and of course your mother had a very hard life. At 14, she was sent out to make her own way because the poverty was such in her hometown. Norms are in large measure, I suppose, developed by the society in which the child is raised. So, I don't know, maybe for your mother to go out at 14 to do this was normal, within a normal range for her. But in your world, the responsibilities that you were given as a young child were not to help feed the family. I guess that was not necessary. I mean, you did have parents to raise you and parents who worked very, very hard in factories and so on. And yet those responsibilities, as you mentioned before, were awesome. Even before you were asked whether they should buy a laundromat, you had to deliver a tuition check. And there's that wonderful scene in which you lost it.
Right.
So the family dynamics were rather unusual. I get the sense that your mother especially came to depend on you as her eldest son. And at the same time, your father seemed to kind of recede into the background. And from what I understand from people I've spoken to, that was not at all an unusual pattern to develop. How do you understand this role reversal?
I think, first of all, just in terms of the Holocaust itself, I think my father suffered much more than my mother because my mother had one brother who survived. She had a remnant of a family. My father lost everybody. Mm-hmm. My mother also was a much more, and is a much more garrulous, sociable person, and she's able to talk about what's going on with her. My father is much, and I think this was probably part of his character, is much more, keeps things within himself more. And I think he suffered a lot more. He never talked about his family. I mean, you may find it surprising. The names are in the book, but if you would ask me right now to name his 6 sisters, I couldn't do it because I never met them. Yet these were my aunts. He never gave them a shape. He never gave them a form. And I think that because he didn't talk about his family, I think he kept things within himself. And I think there was a certain, I don't want to use the word depression, but there was, because he had moments of great joy, and he enjoyed life, he enjoyed his children, but there was a certain darkness inside him that none of us could touch.
In terms of, what do you think that men in general had a harder time adapting to, circumstances here than women? I mean, is there something, the demands of American culture, or does it have to do with perhaps the particular generation and the expectations of the man to be the provider, and this image, of course, as the provider was shattered? Do you think that perhaps made it more difficult for a man than for a woman?
I think I've understood that it's particularly for immigrants, it is much more difficult for a man than a woman. There are these expected roles. I mean, a man in Poland working as a farmer in a small farm had a certain status, whatever it was. There was a certain status to it. You come over here, you don't know what your job will be. Right. You're not trained to do anything. You can't farm anymore because you're living in Manhattan or the Bronx. You've lost your bearings. And, a woman at least can fall back on a traditional role. By the way, my mother did not. My mother went out and worked as well.
Yes.
But in terms of your self-image, it's got to be much harder, given the societal expectations for a man. My father took the first job that was offered him. He ended up working in a factory that made ironing board covers in New Jersey. I know this wasn't his dream of what he wanted to do. Mm-hmm. In fact, my father did want to go back to owning a farm.
The chicken farm. The
chicken farm. They went out to New Jersey, spent couple of days there, and my mother would have none of it. She saw herself as a Warsaw sophisticate because even though she went to Warsaw to work, she'd spent about 5 or 6 years there and joined joined a choir and was familiar with a literary club there, and kind of was on the outskirts of some political clubs, and saw movies. My father never saw a movie until he was in Russia, until he was in his 20s. So she saw herself as a much more cosmopolitan intellectual, if but my father, had none of that.
Did she also develop language skills more easily than he? English language skills?
And she did. She did. Well, she had more access to people who were speaking English. She also had
because of her job, or?
Well, I think so. More people spoke. I mean, the place where she worked, there were more people who spoke English. My father worked with almost all the people in his factory were Spanish speaking, and there were 3 or 4 other guys who spoke Yiddish. So he never really picked up English too well. I'm sorry.
There are these lovely scenes in which you depict him polishing shoes, and he seems to have taken a great deal of pleasure in something that he could do and could do well, and perhaps could do for his family, and it's very, very tender as you describe him. There's one scene here where I guess, and this is what's so beautiful about this, because you, of course, are giving us the perspective of a very young child. I admired my father's muscular shoulders, but was sometimes ashamed of them as well. They were the shoulders of a laborer, and I was going to school with children of businessmen and well-to-do merchants. There was also something threadbare about his undershirt and underpants. Why was he not in pajamas, even a robe? And why was he polishing our shoes? Where was his self-respect? Go ahead, comment, please.
Well, you know, the world of my world as a young boy, and I think the world of a lot of the refugees was quite complicated, because some of it had to do with being an immigrant, some of it had to do with being a survivor. I'll give you an example. My mother came from a family where her father studied a page of Talmud every morning, and she wanted us to go to yeshiva. So she put us in Manhattan Day School, which is now on 75th Street, but used to be on 104th Street. My father took the first job he got because he needed to make money. The job required him to work on Saturday. So I was going to yeshiva with a father who was working on Shabbos. And it just produced a lot of difficulties for me.
Conflicts, sure.
I mean, you know, obviously the book is told from a child's point of view. As an adult now, I completely understand what my father's choices were, and they weren't many. Most of the refugees, no matter what their background, my father came from an Orthodox home too, but you know, during the war, he lost the habits of Orthodoxy because, you know, to survive, you sometimes ate pork and beans, and that was a good meal, you know, or potato peels, you know. So I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, your mother speaks in her journal quite often of, you know, the big deal was getting some lard.
Right, that's right. That's right.
For survival. So nonetheless, you were a child growing up in the urban America of the 1950s, and you describe that landscape vividly. In fact, there's a description of the walking tour of Manhattan that you took with your young buddies when you were probably much too young to do so.
Right.
And it's really an uplifting celebration of freedom and possibilities. In fact, one of the critics I read wrote that it was a very romantic view of Manhattan that you had. The quote, "Like Christopher Columbus, I was charting my own route to a new world." I mean, it's marvelous.
Well, I fell in love with New York right away. I remember that from an early age. I wanted to grasp it by looking at maps, understanding where every street was, where every significant building was. It's something that's kind of stayed with me through much of my life. I've always had this love for the city. I don't live there right now. That's a complicated story, but you know, I stayed here pretty pretty well into my late 40s. But I always had this great love for New York, and I think as a child, I wanted to know as much as I can about American history, about geography, and when this opportunity presented itself to go walk down to Chinatown from 102nd Street, I seized it. You know, look, one of the things was this was new terrain to me, and it was. I needed to really understand it and grab it, and it was also an exciting terrain because, you know, one of the nice things that happens when you're an immigrant is that you have nowhere to go but up, and so, you know, the thought of seeing all those buildings with doormen in front of it, you know, where I might live someday,
dreaming,
you know, was a nice vision to have.
Do you remember walking past the New York Times?
I'm sorry?
Do you remember walking past the New York Times building?
No, it didn't rest on my conscience yet. But I remember my friend Maury at a you know, I forget whether he was 10 or 11 or whatever it was, you know, looking up at General Motors and telling me he wanted to be the you know, the chief executive there someday. You know,
whatever happened to Maury?
He's now an accountant in California, but you know,
I'm sure he's doing well.
He's doing okay. But you know, that's the kind of dreaming we did as young kids.
Sure. So part of growing up is always about learning survival skills. I mean, you need survival skills just to deal with a schoolyard. It can be an intimidating place. But for you, it presented another arena of conflict. Because the survival skills, I think, that you sensed that your parents were teaching you were somewhat different from the survival skills that you figured that you needed as an American. These were stories about the wilds of survival. They weren't about pride or valor or prowess. In a corrupt and racist continent, where the decks were stacked against them, the impoverished European Jews were always scraping by on a willingness to do what was necessary to survive, even if that meant surrendering pride or principle. In America, though, pride and principle seemed to be paramount. And as I eavesdropped on these stories from the periphery of the kitchen table, I learned subversive lessons that were out of step with the America I was absorbing. American history and culture were starting to teach me to stand up for myself and fight for what I believed was right. And my parents and their friends were teaching me to maneuver and outsmart and go at obstacles in roundabout fashion and at all costs to keep myself intact. And since their lesson had proved right for them, had been tested in the cauldron of bitter experience, it was a hard lesson to shrug off. How do you think you resolved this conflict? Or are you still resolving it?
You know, I think when you grow more comfortable, the conflict begins to resolve itself. Mm-hmm. You know, you don't have to be as suspicious and as cynical. You just adjust in a certain way. But I can understand why my parents took the approach they did. I mean, you know, they one of their survivals. If I had to quote a strategy of theirs. It would be machte nicht wisselijk, which is they would show up in places and needed to get something done, and this philosophy of pretend you don't understand what's going on, pretend you don't know, right, kind of worked for them, because you know, it's if I could give an example, my mother is the kind of woman who can return a teapot several years after she bought it because it malfunctioned in some fashion to Macy's, right? You know, even though it's comic, it also captures a certain strategy of hers, because I'm sure that the salespeople get completely frustrated with dealing with her and give in. You know, and I obviously, you know, I don't have to do those things anymore, and I wouldn't want to, but there's also a certain wisdom to much of their approach to life, because, you know, they did bring a certain cynicism and a certain skepticism to much of life. I think I have developed a certain skepticism that maybe some of my friends and colleagues who didn't go through my experience don't share. I give you an example that's in the book, but just because it comes to mind very quickly. When I was in City College, I was editor of the paper, and eventually, you know, editor-in-chief. But there was one year, Clyde Haberman, my friend, was editor-in-chief. I was his news editor, the second in command. And we were trying to put out our complement of issues, and we ran out of money. And Clyde came to several of the editors and said, you know, I'm going to give my scholarship check, the Regent scholarship check, for $150, and use it so we can put out this last issue. And I, of course, said, sure, I'll do that too. And another person said, I'll do that too. So we paid for this last issue out of our scholarship money. And I went to, I had to tell my mother I was doing this. And she said, you're going to give them $150? I said, well, but the student government will see that we're doing this for a noble cause and they'll repay us. She says, if you use your money for this, you can say goodbye to it. You'll never see it again. And she just had this idea that she knew that a student government that needed money for its own causes wasn't going to repay us out of the goodness of their heart. And she was right. We put out that last issue, but we never got repaid for it. But it's that kind of suspiciousness that has served her well. For me, I think it went too far, and I eventually had to begin to drop it, strip myself of it. And I've worked hard to do that. I'm still, you know, overly, probably my wife will tell you I'm overly suspicious and overly, but I've tried to relax about those things.
But you don't think that your mother was reacting the way any adult would have? I mean, there's an age thing there,
probably,
too.
I mean,
that
look,
gap is between your idealism and her hard experience. I don't know that I wouldn't have said the same thing she said.
Well, you know, each story, you know, may I think be adapted to any person. You know, that may be universal in some sense. But I think, you know, together, one after the other, they begin to define a character, and I think that these characteristics became part of the character of the refugees.
You know, what I find remarkable is how your mother she seemed to know what was going on, where, how. I mean, knowing, for example, where to go to get you that atlas that you wanted, knowing that the Bronx High School of Science was a very special school, and how to go about taking the exam and making you do it again the following year, because this was an entrance, to a successful life. How did she ever know? How did she learn all these things?
It's kind of very impressive. She just picked things out of the ether. I can't say how. You know, she's a woman at that time had a 7th grade education. At that time, she eventually, after she retired, went to Hunter College and got a BA degree.
That's incredible.
In English and American literature. But in those days, she had a 7th grade education. And yet she would hear things from people, who was a good doctor, who wasn't. Where the best place was to buy a coat for the winter, and we would schlep down to Levine and Smith, because which no longer exists. But she also heard things like, what the best high school in the city. Somebody must have said, the best high school in the city is Bronx High School of Science. She decided that's where I was going to go, and she knew what had to be done to make it happen, and she worked very hard for it because, and all the refugees did that. They worked very hard for their kids because there was a sense among the refugees that their own lives were maybe behind them, that they were never going to recover because of the loss of time and the loss of country and the loss, that they were never going to really achieve anything special or achieve anything great. And they put all their energies into their kids, to a fault. I think it's a lot to ask a kid to provide the entertainment and the achievement that and the affection that the dead no longer could, and the success that the parents can no longer achieve. But they put that kind of energy into it.
And what if the kid failed?
That's right.
And didn't live up to expectations?
It became, it was difficult.
Yeah.
It was difficult.
Yeah.
It created a sense of anxiety and a sense of you must do this but on the other hand, I think a lot of positive comes out of that too, because I've never been easily defeated. If I don't do something the first time, I try it again, because that's how my parents went at things. They have real spunk. Now again, that's just the way they are, and there are lots of people most people who have lots of spunk did not go through the Holocaust. But I think that there's a lot of their own experience that through the war that kind of rubbed off on me, the sense of working hard and being vigorous and trying again and again.
One of the most moving scenes for me was the one in which you are to dress up as George Washington for the school play. And you went up in GI uniform, General Washington in GI uniform. The reason it's moving is I'm not sure whether the compassion I felt upon reading it was more for your mother or more for you, because I would imagine that it would be terribly embarrassing. And by the way, that teacher made a splendid recovery.
Right.
But for you it was kind of a double humiliation, because not only were you dressed inappropriately, but it was your mother who had dressed you this way.
Right. But I think at that time, I was ignorant enough not to quite understand what I was doing wrong.
Thank God.
It was the 2nd grade, so if that's what your mother thought you ought to do. If I knew better, believe me, I would have told her, don't get me a general's outfit.
But I think it's a very telling and illustrative, I think, incident. This failure on the part of the mother to do what she should in order to make her child adapt perfectly. I mean, I'm sure that she sensed it.
Well, the reason I told that story in the book, just to fill in, I was asked to play George Washington chopping down the cherry tree as a kid, and my mother asked me, essentially, who's George Washington, because she had just been in this country a year, had a vague idea, but wasn't sure, so I told her he was a general. So she went out, for those of you who haven't read the book, she went out to a used clothing store and found a pair of GI fatigues left over by somebody who probably had been in World War II, and cut them down to my size, and I played George Washington chopping down the cherry tree in GI fatigues. But I put that story in the book not to embarrass my mother, but because I wanted to show how hard the refugees, the survivors worked to make sure their kids never felt deprived or second class.
Mm-hmm.
And that was true. You know, my parents sacrificed their own pleasures. You know, my parents never took a cab. They never went to the theater. They never ate in a restaurant. You know, but for us, they would, you know, buy a good suit, make sure that they would, you know, they would try to get us into a good college, for example, and save the money to make sure that happened. That they would not skimp on.
I was amazed at the bar mitzvah that you had. You know, so few years later.
Made sure we had a bar mitzvah.
But it was such an American bar mitzvah, because my understanding is that boys in Europe, the father would take them to shul and they would get an aliyah, and that was it.
Right. Well,
so
I was going to Manhattan Day School, and everybody in Manhattan Day School had a catered bar mitzvah. Right. So my parents took whatever they had and paid for a catered bar mitzvah. And again, I didn't appreciate this at the time, but you know, again, looking back, I understand that they went through, you know, it must have hurt them to make sure I had this. But they brought it off. And it was, you know, it was a particularly joyous occasion because, you know, as I think I try to write about in the book, you know, here, again, this was a bar mitzvah. Everybody has something of a bar mitzvah. But for the refugees, this was a particularly joyous occasion because, you know, here was one of theirs where the Jewish community itself was safe. And, you know, I feel, looking back, that the dancing they did was a kind of a triumph. Maybe, I mean, maybe this is a kind of literary conceit, but I think it's not stretching it too far, because I think, you know, Hitler wanted to wipe out the Jews and wipe out their world, and here 10 years, was it 10 years later, 12 years later, he was gone, and my parents and their friends were dancing and celebrating that one of their little children had come of age in this country.
Right, right. So your parents, you said, were both of an Orthodox background. In fact, your mother's father was a Malamed, a teacher, and so Jewish learning in her home was prized. And through the 9th grade, as you mentioned, you had a yeshiva education. You make an interesting comment in those pages in which you talk about, well, at this point, I think it's already MTA.
For 1 year.
For 1 year.
Right.
And you learned with Rabbi Macy Gordon, that you credit here.
Who, by the way, called me from Israel after 40 years. Somebody had told me he was in the book. But anyway, go ahead. Yeah, sorry.
I see. Let's see. So here also was Rabbi Macy Gordon, my Talmud teacher, who delighted in the dazzling disputation of Gemara and made me delight in it too. Yes, the sages were arguing about the fine ethical points of finding a vessel in a dung heap. Does one claim ownership because the vessel is considered discarded? Must one attempt to return it because it might have been lost or stolen? However mundane the issue, the sages could argue razor-thin distinctions for pages. I began to appreciate how baroque are most of life's significant issues. Questions would not just be solved by a spurt of passion, but had to be finely analyzed and assayed. There were complications and countervailing aspects to everything, and these often made action and decision difficult. At the dawn of the often self-righteous peace and love 1960s, a dialectic like the one over finding a vessel in a dung heap became a formative lesson. So I find that an interesting, if somewhat puzzling, statement, and I wonder if you could comment on it, explain it.
Well, I think that I never fell into some of the simplicities that came out of, let's say, the Vietnam era. I mean, it was a complicated issue. Maybe ultimately the Vietnam War was wrong, but it was complicated, and it wasn't something that could be answered by slogans like Jane Fonda might have been spouting about supporting North Vietnam and the Viet Cong. There was, this is the view I took. Again, ultimately, the war, I would say now that the war was wrong, but I also understood that there was a battle America was fighting. Maybe this was the wrong one, but there was a sense that there were a complicated situation there between the North and the South and the communists, and it wasn't a question of black and white and heroes on one side and good. I mean, after all, look what has become of Vietnam. It is a dictatorship. Whether we should have had our troops killed to save the Vietnamese people is an argument that I would say is something I would say we shouldn't have done. But I always felt that in analyzing anything, that these were complicated situations and that you couldn't just slough them off with a slogan. And I think that having had a Gemara education gave me a little more tentativeness before I leaped into causes.
Was that a good thing?
Sometimes it's a bad thing. It means you can get kind of paralyzed with overthinking something. But I think ultimately, as a journalist, it's trained me to really listen carefully to both sides of every question, and see where and take note of the virtues on both sides.
So you mentioned at one point also that while your classmates were listening, for instance, to Pete Seeger, and of course music is so important to an adolescent's development, you were listening to Frank Sinatra. So you were totally out of step.
Yes.
Do you think that you resented the fact that you were not part of these, I don't mean Pete Seeger, but part of these movements, part of the mainstream in that sense? Was that something that you felt, resented is the wrong word, but perhaps regretted?
What, did I regret? Possibly. In other words, it's possible that because I felt I wasn't part of the mainstream, I kind of found my own niche, and it may not have been for the best of reasons, may have been for other reasons. Maybe looking back, it would have been great to have been part of the the rock and roll crowd at high school, but for whatever complicated reason, and I try to sketch some of those in the book, it didn't happen. So I fell back on my world of Sinatra and jazz, but in terms of the politics, again, this is something that relates very much to my parents' experience. A lot of the kids when I went to showed up at Bronx Science, a lot of the kids at the school were the children of, for want of a better term, West Side lefties. Okay, people whose parents had, and in some cases, they were well-known targets of the McCarthy era.
Yeah.
They would show up with guitars and sandals up to their knees and wear buttons to stop all nuclear explosions and refuse to participate in air raid drills. And some of them would be very sympathetic to the Soviet cause. And my parents had been in the Soviet Union and knew how illusory that society was, that it was a fraud, that it depended on a black market for people, to allow people to have the most basic needs, and that it was extremely corrupt and produced very little for its citizens. My parents told me stories about that, and I had a clear sense of the difference between America and a communist government, and so I would argue with these people who probably did not have that kind of experience. But of course, it excluded me from the Pete Seeger crowd too.
Right. Well, the book is really about belonging, or the steps taken to belong. So, was this where a failure in belonging? Is this something that you think is a failure?
Probably.
Okay. But back to the issue of Judaism. Do you think that the American context, as you experienced it then, was conducive, or did it run counter to religious?
Sorry, I didn't catch it.
Conducive, or did it run counter to religious development for you, your group, your experience?
Well, again, as a son of survivors, it was complicated because my, as I said, my father worked on Saturdays. I was going to yeshiva. It was, there were lots of questions about where was God during the Holocaust, which I understood in my bones, even if they weren't spoken by my parents. In fact, I didn't. My father never said anything until I once asked him. We were looking at pictures of a 1981 gathering of Holocaust survivors in Israel, in Jerusalem, and I asked him, and he's sitting there looking at the Wailing Wall, what were you thinking? And he said, I was thinking how angry I am at God that He took away my sisters and my parents. So this was the kind of relationship that my folks had with religion. So it was conducive in the sense that there was a large organizational community of synagogues and yeshivas, and that encouraged a certain belonging to a practicing Jewish world. On the other hand, there were lots of difficulties and questions that undercut it as well. I hope I'm
yes,
answering.
No, I just again, there's a wonderful scene in which I think you're with Maury and you find yourselves at the Horn and Hardart or someplace, and you taste your first ham sandwich, I believe it is.
Right.
And I'm wondering whether you do this with a sense of, this ham sandwich is more American than anything else, or whether it was an act of rebellion.
Probably a little of both, and it was interesting that I went through that for quite a while. I think, one of the themes of the book is that I wanted to be very American. That was very important to me. I mean, I now regret, for example, talking my parents out of speaking Yiddish, because I've lost a lot of my Yiddish as a result. That was my first language, and it's such a wonderful language. I'm sorry. You're quite. I had a point.
Well, my question was whether it was an act of rebellion or whether you felt, on the contrary, that it was an act of affirmation, that it meant being
Right.
more American.
But what I said was that it was very important to be American, and at some point, my feeling was that Sinatra and the American movies I loved, and my knowledge of America and my immersing myself in the American world were very important to my development. It wasn't until my 30s, and luckily I never lost a tie to my religion. I think that yeshiva training stayed with me always, and my parents' faith stayed with me always. They never lost their faith. It stayed with me, so that when in my 30s, I began to think about who I am and what I want to be. I found that I found a need to return to some connection with a synagogue, for example, and that was a result of my connection, of a connection that I never lost. But in those years, in those youthful development years, being American was really a prime goal of mine, because my parents were so un-American.
Right. I'm going to stop just for a moment. I do have a couple of other items that I'd like to discuss with you, but I just wonder whether anybody would like to comment or has questions. Or I said questions, and yet, we haven't stopped talking. So
there was a movie that came out recently called The Gray Zone. It spoke about the Sonderkommando inmates who had to participate in the annihilation of their fellow Jews, herding them into the gas chambers and into the furnaces. Did any of your parents' family ever speak about any sense of guilt that they might have had to compromise their sense of right and wrong, ethics to survive at the expense of somebody else?
Well, my parents were not in concentration camps. They survived the war. My mother was under Nazi occupation for several months, but she had a brother who was a communist sympathizer and told her, let's go to Russia, life will be better. And of course it wasn't, and he never made it out of the war. But the guilt of the guilt that you're talking about specifically, they obviously never felt, but they definitely carried with them a guilt at could they have done something different in terms of their families? Did they work hard enough to persuade their families to get out? I know my mother certainly talked about this quite a bit. My book contains several chapters that are essentially excerpts of a memoir my mother wrote, and she talks about how she had to make up her mind to follow her brother or stay with her parents and her little brothers and sisters, and she ultimately chose to follow her brother. But part of her has never forgiven herself that she let the family stay in Artvatsk, her town there. No one knew, obviously, what was going to happen. No one suspected that Hitler was going to murder Jews in the wholesale fashion he did. But that's a logical explanation. Internally, she feels that she did something wrong. She talks about her. She has a little brother who asked her, because when they went to when she came back to Otvatsk after the Nazis occupied Poland, there was hunger had already begun to take over people's lives, and her little brother asked her for a pork sausage, to buy her a pork sausage. They were walking in a street, and she said, we can't. I can't buy it for you because Daddy would be upset. We don't eat pork. And she can't forgive herself for not having bought him the pork sausage, because she never saw him again after that day. And that brother who told her to go to the Soviet Union he was eventually jailed for selling a shirt on the black market so he could, buy some food, because that was the compromise you made in the Soviet Union. And he eventually wound up in jail. My mother managed, again, through her scrappy personality, to get him a new trial, but by then the Nazis invaded the Soviet Union. The trial never took place. The second trial, he never was freed. It's more complicated, but anyway, he never was freed, and she never saw him again, and she till this day can't forgive herself for not having done more to get him freed. So that kind of guilt over decisions you did and didn't make has stayed with her, and it stayed with my father as well, I'm sure.
I was wondering if you ever talked to your brother or sister about your parents' feelings about what they went through, and whether your brother and sister felt the same way that you did or differently.
That's a good question. We have our own way of communicating with each other, and certain things are understood. Have we ever had a very lengthy discussion, even of the kind I'm having right here? No. But we kind of understand each other, and you don't have to say everything. And I think and they've obviously both read the book and talked to me a bit about it. And I think they feel many of the same things.
Sir.
Your description of your mother and father is remarkably vivid. Of course, you obviously had a remarkable mother. Be so articulate and write that fabulous memoir. And the fact that you only learned quite late, even the story about your father's feeling about his sister's death, I guess what it was, your daughter or niece asked him a question for a paper she was writing. What I was intrigued about since the book, have you heard more from your father about his memories? Because it's as if he was holding it in for so long, and even that little bit he blurted out brought tears to his eyes, to anyone reading it.
My brother actually sat down with my father and again tried to ask him a whole bunch of questions about his life. My father is not a terribly talkative person to begin with. Right. So unless he's the kind of person, if you ask him, so tell me about your mother. What kind of person was she? He said, she was a Jewish woman. I said, yeah, but, what did she look like? How did she sound? What did she, wear? He said, she was a Jewish woman. He doesn't bring the same kind of literary sensibility that I think my mother brings to it. She's read Tolstoy. She understands that a person needs a description. A person needs a psychology. A person needs a sense of the weather and if you're describing an event. So it's pulling teeth when you ask him those questions. My brother tried as well, and he managed to come up with many details that I hadn't, just because he asked different questions. He found out that my father's farm, they had an outhouse. It wasn't indoor plumbing. I didn't think they asked that question. But he didn't find out very much more about the sisters. I'm sorry. I take that. I'm trying to remember. Was it I who found it out, or anyway? We did. For example, we found out that two of his sisters were twins. I didn't know that. And that one of the sisters was married and had children. I didn't know that for most of my life. I knew that only in recent years. So some things have come out, but unfortunately my father also had a stroke in May, he's recovering very slowly, but he's lost a lot of his mental acuity, and my guess is I may never find out any more about it.
I'm interested in the structure of your book. You made certain choices. There is your mother's memoir, which is so artfully told, but you selected clearly when you were going to interpolate which excerpts from her memoir. So I was wondering, what was your thinking there? What sort of a connection were you trying to draw between your mother's life and your experience here?
Well, it came about in a very spontaneous and unplanned fashion, and I'll tell you a bit of the story. Mm-hmm. I wrote my book over several years, and the story basically started when I was 5 years old and arrived in America on the first day here, and ended when I left home when I was 21. When I gave it in to my editor at Scribner, she said to me, I like this, and she read it, she said to me, I like this very much, but I feel like the book needs more about your parents' lives before the war and during the war. Mm-hmm. I was not writing, I was determinedly not going to write a book about the Holocaust, about the war years. I was writing a book about growing up American after the Holocaust. That's the subtitle of the book. Right. But when she said this to me, I figured, she knows what she's doing. And so I decided to interview
your mother,
my parents. I began with my mother, just because I knew it was going to be easier. And I started asking her some questions. And after a few questions, and I had a notebook and a tape recorder and the whole schmeal, just like a journalist. And she, after a few questions, she says to me, "Why are you asking me all these questions? I wrote it down." And she goes to a closet, and she pulls out this composition book, this black and white speckled composition book that our children use for first and second grade kind of thing. And the title page was "A Legacy Given to Her Children by a Survivor of the Holocaust." Mm-hmm. And it was clear that she intended to leave this for us. I began reading it, and it was lyrical. It was, just beautifully told. My mother's best courses when she was in college were writing courses. She obviously has a natural writer's gift.
I heard someone ask, was it in English?
In English, mm-hmm. Yes, right. And I decided that rather than simply retell her story, that I would actually take some pieces of it. Mm-hmm. And that's what I did. And as I said, there are about 8 chapters that contain her story. And my father's story really just wasn't going to happen, and it wasn't going to work. So I tell as much as I know, but I didn't do the same thing with him. Obviously I edited my mother's story, but I didn't write it. I didn't rewrite it. I tightened, and she feels that I should have used more of her story, and that I should have given her a chance to work on it some more, because she
revised, sure.
She could have told even more and even better, given a more thorough and better account of herself. Mm-hmm. And there's sometimes she's referred to this book as my book.
Good for her.
But
anyway, you have to admit that it is in many ways.
Of course. But that's how it developed. There was no plan, and so when I took her story, I try to find ways of weaving it through my story. And
So what were some of those considerations, just briefly?
well,
do you
there were
recall?
some stories that echoed each other, and they worked kind of well. I'm trying to just, I didn't prepare the answer to this, but let's see. There's a story about, for example, my first day of school, or my introduction to school that I talk about, and then I describe her introduction to school, and she
With a box of crayons, is
Yeah.
that what you're referring to?
well, I talk about the impact of a box of crayons on me.
Right.
And and she had written in her memoir about coming home from school and asking her father, having to ask her father to buy a book,
Right, right.
and knowing he wasn't going to be able to afford the book, and so he went out to a next door neighbor and bought a very used copy of the book from the next door neighbor, and he put a cover on it,
Found it.
and stayed up all night sewing. The father, my grandfather, who I never met, sewing the binding, so that she could have this book at a price he could afford. And I thought, however difficult it was for me to stand the fact that I only had this small box of crayons when a wealthier girl in the class had this box of 64 crayons, that here, this story was so much more
Right.
powerful. And so I put it in at that point.
So your story follows really a logical, chronological pattern,
Yeah.
but it turns out to be a mystery because it's only in the last few pages that we find out the secret of your birth.
Right. Well, that's because it was only relatively late in life that I found out the secret of my birth.
Right.
I had been told for all my life that I was born in Lublin, Poland. And when I was, I think, applying to graduate school, I had to produce a copy of citizenship papers, my citizenship papers. I looked through my parents' documents, and which they kept in this folder in their night table. And I was going through the papers, and I came across this card which said that they were married in 1947. Well, I was born in 1945, 2 years before that date. So I went over to my parents. I said, "Hey, Mom and Dad, what happened here?" And they first tried to tell me that, oh, it's a mistake or whatever. And then they finally decided that they were going to tell me the truth, which was that I was never born in Poland. I was born in Russia, not only in Russia, but quite deep in Russia, in the Ural Mountains, in a place called Lisva. And in fact, they were married in kosher fashion in Lisva. But after they left Russia and had to apply for a visa to the United States, again, with their survival skills, they knew that coming into America, having said you were in Russia, as, by the way, thousands of the survivors did, they knew that coming into America, having said you were in Russia, would make it difficult to get in here, because this was, again, the beginnings of the McCarthy era. So they said they were in Poland, and they spent the war in hiding in Poland, and that's where I was born. And I only found out that story, at the age of 20, 22, 23.
So we have in recent years come to the realization that
And by the way, it was very disorienting.
I'm sure, I'm sure.
You know, suddenly your life story takes a very different shape.
More disorienting than if you found out that you were born in 45 and they were
Right.
married in 47.
Right.
All right.
Okay.
So we have in recent years come to the realization that the children of survivors have really borne the scars of their parents' past. And sometimes these scars are almost pathological in nature. Last year we met with Thane Rosenbaum, and he looks very hard at that question in Secondhand Smoke. Your portrait of a little boy named Simon, who was actually born in a concentration camp, is a case in point. But your own story, your own case, I think, is the trauma you speak of is really much more subtle. It's a sort of generalized anxiety that a child senses. Can you comment on the phenomenon of the second generation, this generation of people who are now middle-aged, who are discovering the roots of their discomfort? I think your book succeeds in dealing with all of these complex issues and is very honest, but it's not an easy thing to do for most people.
Well, you know, I would say that certainly there was a residue of greater anxiety, a greater feeling of peril. I think, you know, some of the things we've talked about already, you know, the expectations on the children were enormous. The sense that they had to redeem their parents' truncated lives. All this, you know, were difficult issues for the children to work through. And, you know, we haven't even talked about you know, let's say concentration camp survivors who had to talk to their children about what they went through. And, you know, whether the children wanted to hear, whether the parents told too much. In some cases, the parents did talk too much. In some cases, the children didn't want to hear. There were tensions around that. There was guilt around that. I mean, I think there were certainly some problems that resulted from that. But I've got to say that from my experience, from the survivors' kids I know, that whatever emotions that linger with them as a result of all that, they've still been able to form very successful lives for themselves. I don't mean just successful in terms of you know, their jobs or the amounts of money they make, but in terms of their ability to relate, to have families, to relate to other people. In fact, there was a book a few years ago by someone I went to yeshiva with named William Helmreich called Against All Odds, where he talks about it's a sociological study of the survivors. And it says that recent large-scale surveys of survivors have actually found that there's no more pathology among survivors' children than the general population, or even the population of American Jews. And, you know, if you look at, and I think this is quite remarkable, and it's really a statement about the resilience of the human spirit of all of us. And I think we need to take that in. You know, if you need some famous names of survivors' children, you know, just to embellish the point, you know, Andrew Grove, the chairman of Intel, is a survivor's son. Max Frankel, the former executive editor of the New York Times. You know, Hadassah Lieberman, the wife of the vice presidential candidate. Wolf Blitzer at CNN. you know.
Well, so you're
So
making the case
what I'm-
that
what
these
I'm
are
trying to
people
say
who are
is-
very successful.
But that people have been able to, you know, work out whatever occurred in their families, whatever what was occurring in their families as they were growing up, or in some of those cases because they were older children, like Max Frankel. They've been able to work it out in a fashion that allowed them to make a fairly solid life for themselves in many ways. Not just through the success in jobs, but through their, you know, emotional well-being. So I think though there are some tragic stories as well, I think overall I believe that. I believe that the strengths they picked up in those families, you know, may have compensated and for whatever deficiencies or stresses that they suffered, and ultimately, you know, allowed them to lead fairly robust lives.
So here's what you say. With all their manic fumbling, my parents had succeeded in restoring a life for themselves. They had created a new family in this world that was not quite as large as the one they had lost, but large and bouncing nonetheless. Maybe, I mused, they had even vanquished Hitler's Holocaust and could put it to rest. I was wrong, of course. The reach of the Holocaust extends throughout a life, to the grave and beyond, informs the generation that experienced it and the generations that follow. But they had planted a substitute life in a different soil, American soil, and it had taken hold and put out tendrils that were now taking hold not too far away. And it was up to me to make a life of what I could. To surrender to the past was fatal. To throw it away entirely futile. Whether I knew it then or not, I would have to acknowledge my parents' tormented history, grapple with it, understand its subterranean subversive force, and live my life with it as a steady companion, unwelcome but undeniable. That's a very powerful statement, but here you definitely acknowledge that you don't put the past behind you.
No, of course not.
I also sense in it, and correct me if I'm wrong.
I mean, how could I put the past behind me when I just wrote a whole book about it? You know? Exactly. You seem to also be saying here in this statement, I think, that not only do you have to come to terms with your history, but that there's, for your own psychological well-being, but that there's also a moral obligation. I feel that. I feel that whatever is going on in our lives, we have an obligation in whatever ways we can to keep alive the memory of what happened, and also to talk about the generation, to talk about our parents' generation and what they achieved in their own fumbling way, because I think we owe it to our folks, and I think the world needs to always keep in mind what happens when you ignore cruelty and tyranny. So I think you know, and because the Holocaust was such a singular event, incomparable to anything else, and I worry that it will ultimately, that the memory will ultimately wither with the next generation and the generations to come afterward. That'll become, you know, like the veterans of the Spanish-American War getting together for, you know, and nobody cares about that anymore. because the Jewish people are so important to me, I feel like it's important that event be kept alive, and so I think that was one of the reasons also that I wanted to make sure the book was written.
So just one more question, if I may. Here's what you say on, I think this is a comment that you make in the context of your nephew's bris. Your sister is speaking. As she winds up her talk, I think of something else. My sister's birth planted an inextricable stake in the bedrock of this country. How ironic that it is she, more than her European-born brothers, who is shaping her family into something of a throwback to the pious Jews of your mother's town. Do you believe that there is an ongoing Jewish Renaissance?
It's not a question of what I believe, it's happening.
It is.
Yeah. There's no doubt that there's been a very strong revival of Jewish identity, and at the same time, a kind of movement within all groups of Judaism for a stronger display of a stronger affinity to the customs and traditions and laws of Judaism, and a stronger willingness to display them. The Jews have become a suburban tribe, and I'm as guilty of that as anybody else. But it's interesting that in New York City, and I wrote a story about this several weeks ago for the Times, that the one area that is continuing to thrive is in terms of Jewish communities, are the Orthodox communities. Mm-hmm. When Jews move out to the suburbs because that's where they're looking to get a big house and piece of land, just like all other Americans. Orthodox are moving into those neighborhoods in places like Kew Gardens and Jamaica Estates. But I also think there's a Jewish Renaissance because this country, in the last 40 years, has become incredibly open to opportunity, and Jews have taken advantage of this. I mean, what I have thought when I was in college, that the student bodies of Harvard and Yale and Princeton would be as heavily Jewish as they are, mm-hmm. That the presidents of those schools would be right. Jewish.
Right.
That 10 senators in the United States would be Jewish, and that companies like Davis Polk would have Orthodox Jewish lawyers. This was a very different world in those days. Mm-hmm. Jews were barred from, were quoted in those colleges, were barred from those companies, and it may be one of the wonderful legacies of the civil rights movement. But it's also meant that there's a willingness on the part of Jews to express their Judaism more forcefully, and a willingness on the part of the country to accept that. And I think that's a big change from when I was growing up.
And probably for the good, young people are not aware of those changes. Young people who are living through them think that this is how it is and this is how it's supposed to be.
They take it for granted.
They take it for granted.
But it wasn't that way.
That's right.
It wasn't that way. Not even 40 years ago, not even 30 years ago.
Thank you so much for sharing your experiences, your life with us.
Thank you.
And thank you, everyone. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did.
Good.
Thanks for listening. For more information on the 92nd Street Y, New York, and all of our programs, please visit us at 92ny.org.